Drink it, Maya. You look exhausted. My aunt slid the mug of chamomile tea across the kitchen island with a soft smile. She didn't know I'd been awake since 3 a.m. She didn't know I'd spent 2 hours that morning watching a recording of her and my uncle in this exact kitchen, measuring something white and powdery into my tea with a kitchen scale, then dumping it in and stirring until it dissolved completely. She thought I'd driven up from Toronto for Thanksgiving weekend. She didn't know I'd driven up to end this. Before I tell you who picked up that mug and what was already sitting in my bag under the kitchen table, drop a comment and tell me, what's the one thing a family member did to you that you forgave, but never actually forgot? You're probably wondering why I was still there, why I kept showing up to that farmhouse every holiday, kept fixing things, kept writing checks, kept pretending. Let me back up, because to understand that kitchen, you have to understand the 7 years that came before it. My parents died when I was 19. Black ice on the 401, February. The kind of accident that doesn't leave room for goodbyes. The will was straightforward. The house in Oakville was to be sold. The proceeds split between me and whatever guardianship arrangement existed for my younger brother Callum, who was 15 at the time. My aunt and uncle, my mother's sister Diane, and her husband Robert volunteered to take him in. They had a place outside of Kingston. Room. Stability. I was grateful. I was 19, working part-time and trying to finish my accounting degree. I couldn't take care of a grieving 15-year-old boy and myself at the same time, so I said yes. I signed whatever they put in front of me because I was drowning. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was letting Robert handle the estate while I was in school. The third mistake was trusting that the number he told me was accurate. My parents had a life insurance policy I didn't know the full details of until 4 years later, when I was doing a tax return and a number didn't line up. I called the insurance company directly. The policy had paid out $340,000. Robert had told me it was $180,000. The difference, $160,000, had been quietly absorbed into an account I had no access to, managed by Robert, who had appointed himself executor, with a document I didn't fully understand at 19 because I was too shattered to read the fine print. When I asked him about it, he had an explanation: legal fees, storage costs, probate, expenses related to Callum's care. He sent me a spreadsheet that looked professional and made my eyes glaze over. I was 23. I let it go because confronting it felt like opening a grave. But I kept a copy of that spreadsheet. Callum turned 18 and moved out of their house. He'd gotten close to Diane and Robert in a way that made me quietly ache. He called Robert Uncle Rob with real warmth. He came home for their birthdays. I understood it. He'd been a child in their house for 3 years. They'd fed him, driven him to hockey, signed his field trip forms, but something had shifted in him that I couldn't reach. He saw my questions about the estate as bitterness. He saw my distance from Diane and Robert as pettiness. He thought I hadn't shown up enough when it mattered. He didn't know what I suspected, because I hadn't told him yet. I didn't have proof. I only had a number that didn't match. I became the utility relative, the one who transferred money to help with Callum's tuition when he was short 1 semester. The one who drove 4 hours round trip to help when the farmhouse roof started leaking and Robert threw out his back. The one who co-signed a line of credit for Diane when she said it was just to cover a cash flow gap in their small business. I did these things because they were family. I did them because my mother had loved Diane. I did them because I was trying to hold together what was left. They let me keep doing it because it was convenient. The shift happened 14 months ago. I got a call from a collections agency. The line of credit I had co-signed had gone 3 months without a payment. I called Diane. She cried. The business was struggling. Robert had made some decisions. They were behind on the farm's property taxes. The number she gave me was $67,000. She didn't ask me directly. She described the situation and went quiet, and the silence was shaped exactly like a request. I told her I needed to think about it. That week, I hired an estate lawyer. I told her everything. The original payout, the number Robert gave me, the spreadsheet, the years of expenses. She went quiet the same way I had on the phone with Diane, but for a different reason. She said the word misappropriation carefully, like she was testing its weight. We started quietly. Document requests. Records. A forensic accountant who owed my lawyer a favor. It took 11 months, but eventually we had a clear picture. Robert had taken approximately $140,000 over 7 years, disguised as legitimate estate expenses and caregiver compensation that he'd never disclosed and I'd never agreed to. Callum didn't know. Diane either was complicit or had looked away so hard she'd convinced herself it wasn't happening. I still don't know which one is worse. I didn't confront them. My lawyer told me not to. We were building a case, and any warning would give Robert time to move money or create paperwork. So I kept showing up. I kept being Maya, the dependable niece. I kept answering their calls. 3 months ago, Diane called me about Callum's birthday dinner. The whole family, the farmhouse. Thanksgiving weekend, because Callum's birthday falls on the same week, she used her warmest voice, the one that sounds like my mother's, which I think she knew. I said I'd be there. 2 weeks before the dinner, I was going through Callum's old room during a visit, looking for a phone charger Diane said was in the nightstand. I found it. I also found a folder wedged between the mattress and the frame, the kind of thing that falls back there and gets forgotten. Inside was a printed email chain between Robert and an insurance broker. The subject line was Policy Amendment Maya Hartley. There was a life insurance policy on me. Robert had taken it out 6 years ago, using documents from the estate period, when he'd still had signing authority over certain accounts. I was the insured. He and Diane were listed as beneficiaries. The coverage was $500,000. I stood there in Callum's room with the afternoon light coming through the curtains, and I felt something inside me go very still. I photographed every page. I put the folder back exactly where I'd found it. I went downstairs and told Diane the charger wasn't in the drawer, and she said she'd find another one. I drove home to Toronto and called my lawyer from the parking lot of a gas station on the 401. I told her what I'd found. She told me not to cancel the dinner. She told me we needed them to act. We needed something on record, something observable, because a fraudulent insurance policy is damaging, but it's not a crime the same way an attempt is. I told her, I understood. I bought a camera, not the elaborate kind. A small recording device the size of a USB stick, designed to look like a wall adapter. I'd read about them. They're legal to use in your own home. The farmhouse wasn't my home, but my lawyer had confirmed that recording laws in Ontario permitted recording in spaces where you had reasonable access as a guest. I plugged it into the outlet behind the fruit bowl on the kitchen counter. It faced the island. The angle was wide. I told Diane my phone charger was nearly dead and I needed to leave it plugged in overnight. She didn't look at it twice. That night, I sat in the guest room and watched the feed on my phone. Robert was on a call in the kitchen. I turned the volume up. He was speaking quietly, but the room was small and the microphone was good. The voice on the other end said, a name I didn't recognize and a number I did, 40,000, by December. Robert said he understood. When he hung up, he leaned against the counter and pressed both hands flat against the surface like he was trying to push through it. He looked like a man running out of time. Diane came in from the living room. She said something I couldn't fully hear. Robert answered. I caught 3 words. Not enough time. Diane opened the cupboard above the stove. She took down a small white box, the kind pharmacies use, and set it on the counter. I leaned closer to my phone screen. She opened it and removed 2 small amber prescription bottles. She set them beside the kettle. Then she put the box away and left the room. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I watched her make tea. She made a pot for the table. She also made a separate mug. She added the bag, poured the water, then opened one of the amber bottles and tapped a measured amount of white powder into the mug. She stirred it. The powder dissolved cleanly. She set the mug slightly apart from the others. I was already downstairs by then. I'd watched it happen in real time on my phone in the upstairs hallway, then walked down slowly so I'd arrive just after she moved away from the counter. She slid the mug toward me the moment I walked in. Drink it, Maya. You look exhausted. I looked at the mug. The tea inside was exactly the right color. It smelled like chamomile. My hands were perfectly steady, which surprised me because I was terrified. I wrapped both hands around the mug. The ceramic was warm. Callum was in the living room watching the pre-game show. Robert was outside moving firewood, or pretending to. The kitchen was just me and Diane and the mug and everything I now knew. Oh, this smells lovely, I said. Did you use the loose leaf? She said she had. She smiled. Is this the one Callum got you from that market in Montreal? I asked. I set the mug down and leaned over it slightly like I was inhaling the steam, but I didn't drink. Callum came in from the living room. He's 26 now, my brother. He looks like our father around the jaw. He came in looking for his phone and stopped when he saw me. You made the chamomile? He said to Diane, already reaching for the mug nearest to the edge of the counter. That one's Maya's, Diane said too quickly. Callum looked at her. Then he looked at the mug in my hands. Then he looked at the mug he'd been about to pick up, which was one of the regular ones from the pot. She always makes me chamomile when I'm stressed, Callum said to me, a little proudly, like it was evidence of something. I looked at Diane. She was watching me with a careful, pleasant expression. You know what, I said, you should have it. I'm more of a coffee person in the morning. I don't know why I said yes. I held the mug out to Callum. Diane's pleasant expression disappeared so fast it was like something underneath her face had shifted. Maya, no. She said it firmly, like a correction. You need it. You've been driving so much lately. I looked at her. She held my gaze for exactly 1 second too long. I'm fine, I said, and I smiled. I kept the mug extended toward Callum. She moved around the island. It was subtle. She didn't lunge. She just repositioned herself, closer to Callum, closer to me. Her hand came up and rested on the counter near the mug. It's chamomile, Diane, I said lightly. Not a limited edition. Callum laughed and reached for it. He was completely relaxed, completely unaware. He thought he was watching a minor negotiation over a cup of tea. Diane's hand closed around his wrist. It was a light grip. She made it look like affection. She squeezed once and said, "Let your sister have her tea, Cal," and she laughed a little, and her laugh was completely wrong. Callum looked at her hand on his wrist. He's not perceptive about people, my brother. He's warm and he trusts easily, and he grew up in a house where affection and control came from the same pair of hands. But he's not stupid. He looked at the mug. He looked at Diane. He looked at the mug again. Something passed over his face that I'd never seen before. A small, quiet reckoning. He looked at me. I didn't say anything. I just held his gaze for a moment. He set the mug down on the counter, very gently, and stepped back. Robert came in through the back door then, stamping his boots on the mat. He registered the three of us standing in the kitchen, the mug on the counter, the silence, and his face went through something I can only describe as arithmetic. He looked at Diane. He looked at the mug. He looked at me, standing there without having drunk anything. "Everything okay in here?" he said. "Fine," I said. "I just remembered I actually need coffee." I went to the machine and started making myself an Americano, my back to all of them, and I let the moment stretch. Behind me, I heard Robert exhale very slowly. I heard Diane pick up the mug. I heard the sink run. I heard the mug being rinsed. We sat down for breakfast. We talked about Callum's job in Waterloo. We talked about the drive from Toronto. We talked about whether it would snow before November. Robert ate quickly. Diane barely ate at all. She watched me drink my coffee with an expression I recognized after a moment. It was the expression of someone waiting for something to happen. Nothing happened. After breakfast, I said I needed some air, and I took a walk down to the end of the property. The farmhouse sits on about 2 acres outside Kingston. There's a line of old maples at the back, and in October the leaves are still half on, golden brown against a gray sky. I stood there for a few minutes and I called my lawyer. I told her Diane had laced the tea and rinsed the mug. I told her Robert had come in and they'd cleaned it up. I told her Callum had seen enough that I thought he could be a witness to the behavior, if not the substance itself. She told me to come inside and call the non-emergency police line in Kingston. She told me to ask for the detective she'd already been in contact with, who was already aware of the case file, the insurance policy, and the financial fraud. She said, "We have enough now." I went back inside. Callum was in the kitchen alone, rinsing dishes. He heard me come in and didn't turn around right away. When he did, his face was careful. "That thing with the tea," he said. "I know," I said. He was quiet. He set a bowl in the rack and dried his hands on a dish towel and folded it the way Diane had taught him, in thirds. He'd been in that house for 3 years. He'd folded dish towels in thirds for 3 years. "How long have you known something was wrong?" he asked. "A long time," I said. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I needed proof before I said anything that couldn't be taken back." He turned and looked out the window over the sink. Robert was visible outside, stacking wood. Diane's car was still in the driveway. Callum said, almost to the window, "The money from Mum and Dad." It wasn't a question. I said, "Most of it, yes." He kept looking out the window. I said, "I need you to stay calm and stay in the house. Can you do that?" He said, "Yes." I called the non-emergency line from the downstairs bathroom with the door locked. The detective was reachable. I gave her the address. I told her what had happened that morning. She asked if I was safe. I said yes. She said officers would be there within the hour and asked me to stay inside and not confront anyone directly. I unlocked the bathroom door and went into the kitchen and made myself a second cup of coffee. The next 40 minutes were the strangest of my life. The 4 of us moved around that farmhouse in a kind of unbearable normality. Diane folded napkins for the Thanksgiving table that we were never going to sit at together. Robert watched the pregame from the couch. Callum sat at the kitchen table doing something on his laptop. I sat across from him drinking coffee and answering emails on my phone, except I wasn't answering emails. I was watching the clock. When the cruiser came up the long gravel driveway, Diane saw it first through the front window. She made a sound like she'd touched something hot. Robert stood up from the couch. They both looked at me. I set my phone on the table face up. I said, I found the policy, Robert. The color left his face in a way I'd never seen happen to a person in real life. I'd read the expression in books. I'd never watched it happen. I said, I also found a forensic accountant who spent 11 months going through the estate accounts. And I have a recording of Diane making my tea this morning. Robert looked at Diane. It was not the look of a husband looking at his wife. It was the look of someone looking for an exit route and realizing his co-pilot had none either. Diane sat down very slowly in the armchair by the window like her legs had decided without her. The officers knocked. Callum was the one who opened the door. He stood there for a moment looking at the two officers on the step, and then he held the door open wider and stepped aside to let them in. That was the whole of his decision, made visible in a gesture. I spoke to the officers in the kitchen. I showed them the photographs of the policy documents on my phone. I told them what I'd seen that morning and indicated the camera adapter behind the fruit bowl. One of the officers bagged it carefully. I gave them my lawyer's direct number. The conversation with Robert and Diane and the officers moved to the living room. Callum and I stood in the kitchen doorway. At one point, Diane tried the explanation that I'd made the whole thing up, that I'd never gotten over my parents' death, that I'd had mental health struggles. The officer asked her if she'd like to speak to a lawyer before continuing. She went quiet. Robert gave a prepared-sounding account about the estate expenses. The officer wrote everything down and said very little. That's what I hadn't expected. How quiet and procedural it was. No dramatic moment. Just writing, and more writing, and the particular quality of silence that happens when people understand a room has changed permanently. They weren't arrested that afternoon. That's not how financial fraud investigations work in Ontario, but the officers left with the camera, my documentation, and the contact information for the detective on the case. Robert and Diane were told to make themselves available. Robert's lawyer was called before we'd finished our coffee. Callum and I drove back to Toronto together. We didn't talk for the first hour. Somewhere around Napanee, he turned down the radio. He said, I keep thinking about the dish towels. I said, what do you mean? He said, they taught me how to fold them. They drove me to hockey. Diane helped me with my university applications. And the whole time there was money missing that was yours. That was ours? I didn't know. I said, I know you didn't know. He said, I should have asked more questions. I said, you were 15. You were grieving. You needed people to take care of you, and they did that part. That part was real. He was quiet again. I said, the problem is they let themselves believe that because they'd done the real part, they'd earned the rest. That taking care of you gave them permission to take from us. We stopped for gas outside of Kingston. Callum pumped. I went inside for 2 coffees and a bag of those small chocolate donuts that come in a paper bag. When I got back to the car, he was leaning against the passenger door looking at the flat gray sky with his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked so much like our father that I had to look at my coffee cup for a second. I handed him the donuts. He said, what happens now? I said, the investigation takes time. Civil suit is already filed. The policy gets voided. The house they bought with the borrowed line of credit is in Diane's name, and there are liens now. He said, and us? I said, that part's up to you. He opened the donut bag and we got back on the highway. The case is still moving through the system. Ontario financial fraud investigations are slow and thorough, and I've made peace with that. My lawyer says the criminal referral is likely. The civil suit is separate and has more leverage than I expected because Robert made the mistake of leaving a clear paper trail. People who steal from grieving teenagers tend to get comfortable. Comfort makes you sloppy. I kept the evidence folder my parents' insurance company sent me, the original one, with the real payout number. I kept it in a filing cabinet in my apartment for 7 years. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because some part of me knew I'd need it. Maybe because my mother raised me to keep records, even when I was 19, and too broken to understand why. The farmhouse is sitting empty right now. Robert moved in with his brother. Diana's staying with a friend in Belleville. I don't know what happens to the property. I don't think about it much. What I do think about sometimes is the mug. Chamomile, dissolved, rinsed away. The fact that she chose something warm and familiar, that she used a comfort to do it, there's a specific kind of cruelty in that. Using the shape of care to cause harm. It's harder to name than outright violence. It hides better. It leaves fewer marks. But I had a camera behind the fruit bowl, and I had 11 months of financial records. And I had a brother who, when the moment came, held the door open. That's enough. I'm not writing this from a place of triumph exactly. I'm writing it from my apartment in Toronto on a Wednesday night with a coffee that's gone slightly cold and a brother who texted me this afternoon asking if I wanted to come for dinner on Saturday. He's learning to cook. He made a roast last week. He said it was okay, not great. He'll try again. I said yes. If you've ever been the one in your family who kept things together while someone else quietly took from the pile, drop a comment. I want to hear from you. And if someone in your life is asking you to drink something without telling you what's in it, whether that's tea or a bad deal or a story that doesn't add up, put it down. Ask the question. Keep the receipt. You're allowed to know exactly what's in the cup before you take a sip.